I'd like you guys to lump this lecture together with the other day, Brazil in World War II, and then kind of keep that in the back of your mind with America's involvement in World War II. Because on paper 3 on your history exam, you might very well have one of those World War II questions say something to the extent of discuss the involvement of any 2 countries of the Americas in World War II. So it could be Mexico, could be Brazil, could be Canada, could be the United States. Sometimes, and I'm not sure they're going to do this on with the new testing, sometimes they have given you like any 2 countries besides the United States. So if you get that, you guys would now be able to do Canada and Brazil. So we're going to talk today about Canada's role in the Second World War, both militarily and diplomatically. Militarily and diplomatically, like the actual fighting, and then the working with other nations to try to work to a victory in the war. Yeah?
Quick question. Was the Brazil one from last time?
Yes. It is online, yes. Okay. So here we go. Brazil, goodness. Canada, at the start of the Second World War, is an independent nation. They are their own country. They are absolutely freed from British domination. They are not a colony of England anymore. They are a part of the British Commonwealth, though. What that means, the British Commonwealth is this collection of nations that were former, at this point, you're talking like Canada and New Zealand and Australia, like South Africa at that point. These former nations that were colonies of Britain, that share a common culture with Britain, share a language, obviously, with Britain, still look at the royalty of England, of Great Britain, as the head of government for Commonwealth states. That's why if you guys go over to Canada and you get some Canadian currency, you're going to see Queen Elizabeth on most of it, right? But they are independent, all right? So it's kind of like they were once a part of the British Empire. Now they're free and independent countries, but they're still keeping some roots there. Today, you guys can take a look at this map, and we see that there are many countries that are part of this British Commonwealth. This is a free organization. There's nothing that compels them to be a part of it. And it really doesn't make much difference for a political scene today. The Queen's role in any of these countries is more just a figurehead title. It has no actual political power whatsoever. They get together every once in a while and have like kind of a mini Olympic Games called the Commonwealth Games where they compete against each other. But for all intents and purposes, it doesn't really matter politically. But it highlights the cultural closeness between these Commonwealth nations and the United Kingdom. Yes, sir?
So if you're saying that the Commonwealth didn't really have any obligations to
right.
Many countries, then what's the main reason why the U.S. is staying out of it?
That we're out of the Commonwealth, because we are very much. I mean, we weren't like we fought for our independence from England. Remember, we like went to war for it. So there was no like amenable. Both sides agree to just like it's not you, it's me. No, it's me. No, it's you. Like this was not a smooth breakup between us and England. This was not Britain granting us independence. We like literally fought a war for it. So and then we fought another war in 1812. So we are not about being a part of this British Commonwealth. Canada, Australia, different story. So when the war comes in early September of 1939, Canada has a choice, like every other nation of the world has a choice. They can jump in or they can stay out. And the Canadians, because of their close cultural and historic ties to Britain, they immediately begin debating in their houses of parliament whether or not they're going to join this war effort. And within a couple days of debate, Canada ultimately decides to declare war on Germany and support the Allied armies in fighting Germany. So by September 10th, 1939, Canada is in the fight. There is one unique aspect compared to Canada, between Canada and America and Brazil or any other country in the Americas. Canada is in this war virtually from the start. The United States, we don't get involved until December 7th of 1941. Brazil and Mexico, they come along even after us. But Canada's in virtually from the start.
The earliest American nation involved, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk really quickly about the contribution of Canada's military, and it is great. It is a tremendous contribution to the Allied war effort. Far bigger than any other country in the Americas short of the United States. But Canada had a long way to go, all right? Do you guys remember when we talked about the Treaty of Versailles limiting Germany's military? And they were kept to a small military of only a defensive force of 100,000 men, right? No air force, no battleships in their navy. That the German army had to be a small 100,000 man army. The Canadian army at the start of this war, was minuscule. Only 5,000 men in active duty in Canada. 5,000. With only 16 light tanks. It's literally the second biggest country on the planet after Russia. And they had a 5,000 man army. It really goes to show that how much the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean is going to protect nations from foreign involvement. If they didn't want to be involved, they didn't have to be involved. Canada and the United States, to this day, enjoy the longest unprotected border between nations in the world. It is a very good relationship and a very safe and secure relationship between our nations. Whereas Germany, when they were limited to a 100,000 man army, they've got nations surrounding them that Germany might feel the need to defend themselves from. Same with France, same with Russia. So these continental European nations require much larger militaries than a country like Canada or the United States would. So let me just give you some numbers. Start with the Canadian Air Force. Very small at the outset of the war. Only 4,000 men in the Canadian Air Force. 279 planes. I am not going to pretend that you guys would ever remember all of these numbers. I just want you to get the point that they're very small. Very limited in terms of military scope. 275 planes in the Canadian Air Force. And most of those were outdated. After the war begins, Canada is going to join with other Commonwealth nations in what is called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. It is a program by Commonwealth nations to train new pilots for this war effort. By the end of the war, over 50,000 pilots will be trained in this program. Half of them Canadian. So, pilot training program. The Canadian Air Force is called the Royal Canadian Air Force. So now we've got another Air Force name. We haven't talked about the Americans very much yet, but we will. The Army Air Corps for the United States. The Royal Air Force for Britain. The German Luftwaffe. But now we're adding the Royal Canadian Air Force to this mix. And they will play an important role in the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi control. Canadian manufacturers, Canadian industry will also contribute to the war effort. And by the end of the war, Canadian plants will make over 16,000 aircraft, new aircraft. Remember, that's compared to the 275 that Canada started the war with. They're going to make 16,000 additional. And our area is vitally important to this. We probably, you guys know a little bit, we haven't talked about it in our class yet, but you know a little bit about our area and the automobile industry and how vital a role we played in producing the weapons of war. Literally all of our consumer manufacturing plants for cars, for example, would be transformed to make the tanks and the jeeps and the airplanes during the Second World War. Canada did the same thing. And Windsor, Canada, on the other side of the Detroit River, is Canada's equivalent of Detroit. It is the auto capital of Canada. And obviously a close relationship between Canadian manufacturers and American manufacturers exists. So Canadian auto manufacturers would do the same kind of transformation and work towards the war effort in Canada. For the Canadian Navy, their role is going to be very similar. A very small... I didn't notice that. There you go. It's for you.
What was that?
A very small Navy at the start of the war. Only 1,800 sailors. Only 15 warships in the Canadian Navy at the start of the war. But through the war and through building programs, that Navy would increase to over 400 ships. The Canadian Navy is going to play a vital role in the entirety of the Battle of the Atlantic. I mentioned this the other day, but the Battle of the Atlantic is this World War II long conflict on the Atlantic Ocean, where German U-boats, those submarines of Germany, German U-boats are attempting to stop and sink any Allied merchant ships making their way across the Atlantic Ocean. Remember, this was a war for resources. And if the Germans could truly blockade the Atlantic, they could choke the Allies in Europe out. So it was vital to get these materials across the ocean. And Canadian warships and the Canadian Navy are going to be vital in getting those merchant ships across. They will serve as both anti-submarine ships. They will target submarines in the open waters. They will also serve as convoy escorts. We'll talk more about the naval war on another day, but to get our merchant vessels across the Atlantic Ocean, the American and the British and the Canadian navies would deploy what is known as the convoy system. And this is where a group of warships would surround merchant vessels in the middle. These merchant vessels, these are not warships. These are not equipped to defend themselves. So they would have the merchant ships in the middle flanked by a dozen or more warships. And then if the U-boats would find them, they would have to deal with the warships before ever getting to the merchant vessels. So basically, it's letting the Germans know, hey, we're coming, we're in a massive convoy, we know you can see us, we want you to see us, so then we can sink you, we can destroy your submarines. The Canadian Army. Again, very small. 5,000 men in the Canadian Army at the outset of the war. It would grow to over 700,000 by the time the war is over. Now, we haven't talked specifically about the United States and our mobilization in this war, but just to give you some perspective, the United States would, at our peak during World War II, have over 10 million men in uniform. So it's comparatively small. But remember, Canada is comparatively a very small country. Hardly anyone lives in Canada, especially compared to its size. So 700,000 Canadians will serve in the Canadian Army during the war. They will see their first combat in France in the spring of 1940. There will be Canadian soldiers at that escape at Dunkirk, talked about early in the war. But initially, because Canada's military was so small and so undertrained, like these are very new recruits being thrown into the mix, they didn't have much of a role early on besides defensive roles.
It's like a World War where they were issued like rifles that were completely ineffective in trench warfare.
Okay. The first major activity, the first major responsibility for Canada's military in the war would be at a raid in a French town called Dieppe. Dieppe. This is in August of 1942. Codenamed Operation Jubilee. Sounds fun, right?
1942.
August of 1942.
France.
Yes. So, what this Dieppe raid was a deception raid. It was made to make the Germans think that an invasion was imminent, that a real invasion was imminent in the West. Remember, this is August of 1942. This is almost 2 full years before D-Day happens, right? D-Day is June of 1944. Stalin was clamoring for an opening of a true Western front, and he wasn't getting it. The Dieppe raid was going to serve 2 purposes. One, keep the Germans on their toes in the West. Make them think that any moment a raid of France could be coming. 2, it was going to give an opportunity to try out some strategies and tactics for amphibious invasions. And so, thousands of mostly Canadian, some British and some American commandos would storm the French town, the beach town of Dieppe. And they would take that town. They would conquer that town. And they would hold on to it for a bit, just a few hours, before they would retreat. There was no intention of holding on to anything. The Allies were not ready for a major invasion at this point. Remember, this is August of 1942. The United States just got into the war in December of 41. We're not ready for that yet. So there's no real intention of holding on to anything. But what actually happened at Dieppe would be an absolute disaster for the Canadians and the Allies involved. They were never able to hold on to the town. The Germans knew they were coming. This invasion was supposed to go into the dark of night. But one Allied warship opened fire at a German ship in the channel. And it alerted the Germans that something was coming. Also, the landing point, the beaches of Dieppe were very challenging because we didn't have any nicely sloping beaches. We had small beach with a cliff face, which made it very difficult for the invasion force to reach the German guns. Those German guns were big enough to neutralize the small Navy escort that was sent with this invasion force. And so in the end, it was an absolute disaster. Of the 5,000 Canadians that went to Dieppe, only 2,000 would return to England. Over 1,000 were killed, and another 2,000 would live the rest of their service in prisoner of war camps, German prisoner of war camps. This Dieppe raid has come to be known. Here's a picture of the beaches at Dieppe, and you guys can see the cliff faces there.
How would you climb up that one once you're there? Well, what's the point of that?
If you ever get a chance to go into Windsor on a beautiful sunny day like this, I highly recommend it. Here's Detroit in the background. There's the Detroit River. There is a park along the riverfront in Windsor called Dieppe Gardens. And it is named in honor of this most disastrous day for the Canadian military in the entire course of the war, and really most of their history. I'm sure there's days in World War I that surpass it, but they've named these gardens the Dieppe Gardens. And if you wander through there, you'll see all kinds of war memorials and remembrances of Canadians' roles in the Second World War, along with First World War and the Korean conflict. And so you will see memorials for all these things there. A lot of names carved in of people that lived in Windsor and fought and died in this invasion. It's something worth checking out, and the view of Detroit from that side of the river is beautiful. Canadians would not stop at Dieppe. They would see later action in Sicily and in Italy in those invasions of that soft underbelly of Europe. But then most famously, the Canadians would take part in the invasion of Normandy in Operation Overlord. Canadian forces would be given one of 5 beaches as their target. It was known as Juno, and we can see what that looked like here. The Canadian Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force also supported the D-Day invasion. So from the very beginning of the war all the way to the end of the war, the Canadian Army had a vital role, albeit smaller than the Americans and the British, but Canada is smaller than Britain and the United States. By the end, over 45,000 Canadians would be killed in the Second World War. So this was no small effort for Canada. I do want to spend a few minutes talking about Canadian politics and Canadian diplomacy during the war. First, with regard to the Canadian political issue. Canada is a very interesting country in that we've got one massive country divided into various provinces, but you've got most of the provinces being English-speaking, and then Quebec. Quebec is a French-Canadian region. Obviously, it used to be part of the French Empire before the British took it from them. And Quebec, obviously, is very different from the rest of Canada culturally. If you ever have a chance to go to Quebec, you kind of don't feel like you're in Canada anymore. You feel like you're almost more in Europe, more in France, because it's so French there. Citizens of Quebec, known as the Quebecois, It's Quebecois, were generally not supportive of the war effort. They were the loudest opposition to Canada joining the war effort at the outset of the war. And many in Quebec were supportive of the Vichy French regime. Especially the right wing of Canadian Quebec politics, where there was a little bit more like nationalism. They kind of liked the nationalism / anti-Semitism of Marshal Pétain and the Vichy French regime. And so you did not have, and I think this is important to note, and we're certainly seeing this in our country right now. Just because we all live in the same country does not mean we all are in lockstep politically with each other. There's a lot of division. There's a lot of political opinions. And Canada at the start of World War II was no different. This will come to a bit of a head with what is known as the conscription crisis of 1942. Now, you guys, did you talk at all about a conscription crisis in Canada for World War I? Yeah. Okay, very much the same story. We're going there again. At the outset of this war, the Canadian Prime Minister, his name is Mackenzie King. You guys can see him here, seated with Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. There's Mackenzie King. At the start of this war, Mackenzie King promised that there would be no overseas foreign service for drafted soldiers. No conscripted soldiers would go and serve overseas. If you were going to get conscripted, if you were going to get drafted, you would merely serve as homeland defense. You would protect your borders. You would protect your coastline. All right? And guys, I know some of you are 17, almost 18, turning 18 already. You guys know that it is not a right of a country or anything. It's an obligation of citizenship of the United States to register for selective service. You have to. It's not like I want to do it. It's you have to do it. It is American law that you have to register for the draft. Now, you don't get thrown in jail if you don't register. You got your draft card, your registration? Very exciting.
Very cute.
I don't think it's coming for you. I don't think you're there yet. But anyway, in the United States, it is our obligation. That is like one thing we have to do as American citizens. Is if our country needs us to serve in its military, we have to answer that call. All right? Canada is very much the same. But after the Canadian experience in World War I, and the isolationism that the United States felt after World War I, Canada was really much the same way. They weren't truly impacted by what was going on in Europe. They didn't need to get involved in that fight. And many Canadians were very upset about being drafted to go fight and possibly die in this European war. Same is going to happen in World War II. So at the start of the war, Mackenzie King makes a promise. If you get drafted, you will only serve as homeland defense. You won't go overseas. But how did the war go, 1939, 40, 41? How was the war going for the Allies?
Pretty poorly.
Badly, right? These first couple of years of the war didn't go well at all. And the reality of the war situation was going to compel Mackenzie King in Canada to need more assistance. It's going to compel Mackenzie King and Canada to offer more assistance to the Allied war effort. Problem was, King had already promised his people that he wouldn't do this, that they wouldn't have drafted soldiers going to fight overseas. And Canada has got the same political issue as the United States and Britain. These are democracies. You've got to answer to your people. And if he's a politician and he outright lies to the Canadian people and starts sending drafted soldiers to go and fight in the war, he's probably not going to be a politician for very much longer. So King's solution to this is to have a plebiscite. We've talked about these plebiscites before. The Saar plebiscite in 1935, where we let the people vote on the issue. And in August of 1942, there would be a plebiscite in Canada. Let the people vote. Should we support conscription of our young men to go overseas and fight against Nazi tyranny? I did make that a little loaded. I'm sorry. Yes. Anyway, all of the English-speaking provinces of Canada voted the affirmative, about 80%. These are territories. They're politically illiterate. I don't know enough about Canadian politics in the 1940s to know. Quebec and the French-speaking population of Canada voted about 73% in opposition to joining the conscription crisis. So for Mackenzie King, he got what he needed. The majority of Canadians, by far, supported getting involved in the overseas conflict. I shouldn't say overseas conflict. Getting involved in sending conscripted, drafted soldiers overseas. But this conscription crisis certainly showed the rift in Canada. Now, as time would drag on, what's going to happen to Vichy France? It's going to collapse. It's going to be outright taken over by Nazi Germany. And then we will have a free French movement in England led by a man named Charles de Gaulle. And so you're going to start to see, as the war drags on, you'll start to see more French Canadians shifting their allegiances now to free France and the Allied movement in the war. By the end of the war, only limited Canadian drafted soldiers would ever see action overseas. For the most part, most Canadians that were serving overseas were volunteers, guys that signed up for the military. Now let's spend just a minute talking about the diplomatic arrangements between Canada and their allies in the war. With Britain, that's where Canada will have its closest relationship. And as we mentioned, from the start of the war, Canada's involved in it. And also from the start of the war, Canada is going to open up lines of credit to the British. And the Canadians will loan over $700 million to the British in order to support their war effort. Or at least $700 million worth of material to fight this war. So strong relationship between Canada and Britain. Same with the United States. Close relationship between the United States and Canada even before the war began. In 1940, President Roosevelt will meet with Prime Minister King, and they will sign the Ogdensburg Agreement. I've written it up here for you. The Ogdensburg Agreement, where our two countries would mutually pledge to defend our coastlines. We would pledge to defend the coastlines of northern North America. A joint defense of our countries. In the next year, in April of 1941, this is right after we pass our Lend-Lease Act, Mackenzie King and Roosevelt will meet again, this time in Roosevelt's home in New York called Hyde Park. It's kind of like the estate of the Roosevelt family in Hyde Park, New York. They meet again, and they will draft what's called the Hyde Park Declaration that will link Canadian manufacturing with the American Lend-Lease Act. So Canadians kind of hopping on board to support Lend-Lease trade with wartime nations.
What was it called?
The Hyde Park Declaration. Hyde, Hyde Park Declaration. That's in April of 41. Finally, the last ally of the big three, Soviet Union. Like the United States and like Britain, Canada didn't care much for Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union before World War II. It wouldn't be until June of 1941, when the Germans invade the Soviet Union, that Canada has to open up this alliance with them. But once Germany invades, Canada will offer support. They will send material aid to the Soviet Union, and that aid will continue through the duration of the war. Questions, comments, anything?